Great having you with us. Welcome back. Clement is not here. My name is Thabo Sholemashau. I'm excited to be in your company until 12 o'clock. And if you've just joined us, welcome. Where have you been? You've missed a very heated open line. We discussed everything else from Liam Jacobs leaving the PA to go back to a place that he had initially described as oppressive, the Democratic Alliance, that is. And now he is gone back there. After some scuffles with Gayton McKenzie, Liam has accused Gayton McKenzie of being a dictator, wanting him to support Fidel Adams and a whole lot of other issues. So he's now back in the fold of the Democratic Alliance. And Gayton has come up, also guns blazing, warning him not to use social media to fight the battles because he'll lose. He'll always come second and he'll become irrelevant in a short while. And we also asked the question, where are you from? Is it fair to ask that black person where you're from? And if you say you're not from, if you say you're from Soweto or peri-urban area, you are seen as less African because Alina Di Plasi, Kolona. No, you can't have that. You really can't have that. Because we were spread out throughout the continent, and the continent would have included Johannesburg, Sandton, Pretoria, Cape Town, everywhere. We would have been everywhere. So some of us are really, truly from Joburg, even though it was not called Johannesburg back in that time. 9 minutes after 10 o'clock, we are going to enter into a conversation with the MEC of Finance in the province of Gauteng, Nkululeko Dunga. He's sitting in front of me. We want to explore the money, the purse of this very important province in the country. You're on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
702.
He's my guest now, Gauteng Finance MEC Nkululeko Dunga, and he has painted a worrying state of finances in the province, citing unpaid invoices, declining revenue collection, irregular expenditure, and municipal debt threatening service delivery across the province. He's announced a program of action which is aimed at restoring financial discipline and improving governance. And Gauteng oversees the implementation of about almost 180 billion rands in 2026-2027 financial year. And Dunga is the Economic Freedom is with Economic Freedom Fighters and is Gauteng chairperson thereof. And he was sworn in as the new finance minister in April, replacing former finance MEC Lebogang Maile. MEC, thanks for joining us here on 702. Good morning and welcome.
No, good morning to you, and thank you for having us, Thabo, and greetings to the listeners of 702 as well.
As you entered the office and put your feet under the desk and slammed your fist on top of the desk and with your laptop, were there any eye-widening matters that you did not expect as you looked into the purse of the Gauteng province?
Yeah, I think, like, in the famous words of Brown Mokgotsi, di tlhako di botlhoko.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It feels like we've been here for a while now.
Yeah.
And one would have thought that the announcement of the Premier on the 1st of April would have been April Fool's joke, But nonetheless, the seriousness of the deployment by the Premier and by the organization that we come from dictated that we actually go right into the deep end and acclimatize ourselves and create a seamless process away from the former Honorable Lebogang Maile, who did some pretty interesting and exciting work, But coming in, obviously, into the understanding and the honest reality is that we are people of extreme honesty and transparency. And we know that, when you are in the Department of Finance or at least Treasury, there's also the conservative nature of how you deal with matters and the dissemination of information, which is contradictory at times because one would tell you that don't say this because it might upset the markets, and then it has a bearing in terms of the budget and access to funding and. But we came into a space where really there are difficulties, extreme difficulties. I mean, you look at the 180 billion rand, and the reality is that we need at least a double of that for us to really just operate optimally. We underspend a lot in terms of infrastructure development as a province. We're sitting at about 7.3%, and we should be hitting, anything between 10 to 15% of what is a budget allocation to us towards infrastructure development. We found a lot of things. I mean, historically, we're sitting at about 50 billion rand in terms of UIFWs, which is unauthorized, irregular, fruitless, and wasteful expenditure, which is historic by nature. That we really need to deal with and close down in terms of forensic analysis, auditing, and holding people to account, and ultimately trying to retrieve some of those amounts, as and when we can, particularly when they are fruitless and wasteful.
Sure.
And coming into the financial year, we are 1.4 billion rand short of what we're expecting to receive, because we've only appropriated 1.4 billion rand less than we should have. We're anticipating to get 8.4 billion out of our own revenue in the previous year. We only got about 7 billion. So we're already into the new financial year, 1.4 billion rand less. So, which is money that we have to make sure that we try and find elsewhere so that we can compensate for that shortfall. Because you can imagine 1.4 billion in terms of its contributing factor into the fiscus itself could be detrimental towards service delivery. But we also found a lot of issues in relation to municipalities. But obviously our backdrop and understanding of municipalities, we're able to identify those loopholes immediately because we come from that structure,
Sure.
Such as unfunded mandates, unfunded budgets being continued in certain municipalities, in certain corners, the lack of understanding and implementation of the MFMA to a full extent. I mean, you look at, like, for example, the city of Ekurhuleni, which is approving budget and the process in itself outside of legislated and constitutional obligations of a majority of council. And
that's where you're from, by the way.
And that's where we're from,
Yeah.
The financial standing of municipalities such as particularly Marafong as well as Mfuleni. We actually even went on to write to them and subject them to Section 138 and Section 140.
Yeah. Allow me to jump in just a little bit, and I'm going to allow you to expand on some of those, because I want us to get into the municipalities and delve into them, the problems therein, revenue and expenditure, the debts thereof. But in layman's term, after we have spoken about the jargon of OPEX, CAPEX, budgets, financial years, and everything else, for someone who's listening to us right now from Gauteng, as the main purse person, if you were to describe the fiscal situation in Gauteng as a patient, how would you do that? Is the patient in ICU? Is the patient walking out of the hospital after great treatment? Is the patient
Critical but stable.
Simo?
Critical but stable. Our budget over the years has increased below CPI.
Consumer Price Index, yeah.
And that to us tells us that the money that you have today, or at least for this year, will not have the same buying power as the year after that. So you might increase in terms of the budget itself based on inflation, because you have to increase based on inflation to a certain degree in terms of the budget composition. Otherwise, it even goes much more worse than that. But on just the main basis that we can't increase our budget beyond the CPI and beyond inflation, and it's much more below that, it's sitting at 1.5, 1.6%. And it's lingering at more or less the same level as the economic growth of the country. But the economic growth of the country is below CPI and inflation.
Yeah. So what are the threats? What are the threats facing the fiscal situation in Gauteng right now? Maybe three threats.
Lack of revenue as the province.
from municipalities who would be
Both municipalities. So the funding model of municipalities in itself to be extremely reliant on electricity as the core function of bringing money in is problematic on its own. Understanding the grid and the challenges that are experienced by ESCOM, but the lack of revenue and revenue leakages are fundamentally problematic for both municipalities and the province. And I say this as I was saying earlier on, that we lost 1.4 billion rand in the previous year, and that was as a result of three main factors. The first factor is that municipalities are not paying the province for motor vehicle licensing renewals, so we have given them the services to be able to collect that for us, and we give them a percentage of 20% of whatever is collected.
How much do they owe you on
we are
that?
not getting. They owe us 2.4 billion.
So
collectively,
municipalities owe the province 2.4 billion
2.4 billion rand.
Okay.
And this is 2.4 that could have been attributed towards service delivery. But at the same time, you've got the function of the province where we have to pay rates and taxes. I mean, we budget about 6 billion rands, towards property payments and so forth as a province. But we are not paying municipalities what is due to them in terms of rates and taxes, water and so forth. We're absconding. And that affects them, and we are owing municipalities 2.4 billion rands.
It squares itself out.
So the net position is relatively the same, but it's no excuse for us not to pay them. In understanding that as we drive here, we go through a pothole, then we come in and then complain. But we have no right to complain because they can just attribute it to say, but you have not paid your own.
Yeah. So lack of revenue is one threat. The second threat?
The second threat is outsourcing. We've got to take a deliberate act as a country and as a government to internalize many of our services that we can internalize, build state capacity. We've got to build state capacity. For example, once again, 6 billion rand is spent towards properties and so forth, and about 2 billion rand is spent on security annually as a province. But we've got what we call traffic wardens who have been found wanting according to the public protector. Let's take them and repurpose them, to look after our buildings and the infrastructure thereof. We would have saved about 2 billion, at least 1 billion we can save from that aspect of it. The second aspect is that we've got a lot of contracted services of things that we can internalize. And I'm happy that the Premier has actually absorbed about 2,500 artisans about 2 weeks ago. And these are people now who can come into our buildings, fix our buildings, fix globes, fix plugs, a leaking tap and so forth, as opposed to us engaging service providers who charge us at least 2 to 3 times what ordinarily should be a market-related price. And that's what we need to do. Not only us as a provincial government, but we should actually express that particular view as well towards municipalities, because a finding consistently, by the way, in terms of the National Treasury on the expenditures of budget compositions of municipalities is that they spend too much on contracted services. So that would be the second point. The third element is obviously corruption, because corruption erodes a lot of, not only does it consume a lot of time, it takes a lot of time for a person to be deliberate in terms of corrupt activities. That's why if they are not engaged in service delivery, you know that they are engaged in something else. It takes too much effort. Not only the effort, but it also deprives us from that which is required of us to do. The building of infrastructure, the payment of invoices on time is attributed towards corruption, because there's what we call syndicates around that we have heard about, where in order for your invoice to be paid, you must give in something. But how do you give in something when you have not been paid? Those certain things. And
that comes from a value chain, if you will, of politicians, officials, and service providers. Generally, that would be those stakeholders would be in that value chain of corruption, because all those are integrally involved.
Well, look, for corruption to take place, there must be a corruptor and a corruptee. So it's an entire cycle that is both macro and micro. You know, for the mere fact that a business person can start engaging or unlocking those conversations means that there will be a response that will be met to it and vice versa. You know, so I don't want to attribute it to just the micro space of governance and the operation of provincial government and exclude the outer layers that could be a contributing factor towards corruption.
Yeah.
It's not an isolated sectoral matter.
Yeah.
It has unfortunately become a society issue
Yeah.
in all corners where it exists that must be really be clamped down on. But
How endemic is it in the province?
I mean, it's unfortunate that the face of corruption in the province and in the country is attributed towards a political face or political faces, that is, without having an understanding that there's a lot of administration and administrators, senior administrators, who do the administration and to a certain degree enable it. And equally as well, businesses who are outside of the state, who are under no scrutiny as well. You know, because they are faceless, it's just the names of the company
Yeah.
without understanding the directors. As I said initially, we've got 50 billion in terms of the opening balance of unauthorized, irregular, fruitless, and wasteful expenditure. So you can just imagine there's a lot of distressed projects across the province. I think the last count we're sitting at 56 or so. They can be an element of attribution that these distressed projects are as a result of some corrupt relationship. Because if you were to look at the company that would have abandoned or performed much more worse at a particular project, you'll find them in another distressed project that they would have undertaken and abandoned as well, costing the state much more money, you know. And in all these municipalities as well, you get to see the very same thing as well. By the way, the city of Johannesburg is sitting over well and above 1 billion rand in terms of unauthorized, irregular, and fruitless expenditure.
Unauthorized.
You know, city of Ekurhuleni is sitting just slightly below 1 billion in terms of its opening balance, according to the Auditor General's notes. And that tells you that we've got a serious problem. Mfuleni has collapsed in terms of service delivery. You find more plastics just lying around more than you would see flowers or grass, even in open fields. There's no waste collection, sewage is everywhere, there's no water. So you get to ask yourself, how is it that we don't have access to water, but there's sewage that is just running around everywhere? You
And
know,
budget is allocated
and
to
budget is
that.
allocated and budget is used, by the way,
Yeah.
on
yeah.
a continuous
Yeah.
basis. And at times, there's even over expenditure of the very same budget.
Yet no service delivery.
Yet no
and
service
what is your
delivery.
role therein? How far do your powers go as MEC of Finance in Gauteng, Mr. Dunga, as far as oversight and also somehow not only using a carrot but applying a stick as well?
Yeah, so we've taken a proactive stance, like to hold municipalities particularly accountable, because now you would note that for a very long time the Department of Provincial Treasury, or at least Finance, has never been a standalone item, at least portfolio, for a very long time. It was always attached to another department, like you would have finance and economic development or finance and so now there is thorough focus, and because there is thorough focus, you get to understand that there are other units that must inform sound governance and sound financial management, and one of the core is municipalities. There's a unit that looks at financials of municipalities, and we've come in, I think in our first 2 weeks of office, we've had to write a report based on Section 138 and 140 of the MFMA for 5 municipalities that are under our custodians: Mfuleni, Lesedi, Morafong, Rand West, and West Rand, you know, to say, look, your finances are not looking good. On a monthly basis, you need to report to us in terms of how much you have collected in terms of revenue, how much you have spent, and what you have spent it for, because we need to intervene here. There are problems, seemingly, you know, and we did that immediately. We've also proactively dealt with many issues like, you know, the city of Johannesburg as well were invested in terms of what National Treasury has been identified as potentially an unfunded budget on the basis that there is this wage bill of 10.4 billion, and the restructuring of the budget and its composition, as well as now, as we are saying, the process of the city of Ekurhuleni in terms of the adoption of the budget, so that it conforms, because the city of Ekurhuleni is the only municipality, by the way, that still does a voice note. Do you agree, yes or no, in terms of the budget composition? But section 160.2 and the MFMA section 30 and 31 are very clear in terms of how you need to adopt the budget, and you need a majority of council and not just council present.
Yeah.
And that's what we do, now in terms of that monitoring and the implementation. We are bound to have a meeting, by the way, with the city of Mrafong in the next couple of weeks as well, because they are under serious financial constraints. And that's just showing our proactive stance as well. Reflect on what the Auditor General would have identified outside of, obviously, our own forensic auditing that would inform the findings of the Auditor General to a certain extent. And that's in drawing reference to what we're speaking of as an opening balance of 50 billion. We're being honest about it. We're saying this is what we have as historic. And it does not necessarily mean that there was corruption, but I've got a different view, and I express this view all the time to say, once you are deliberate in doing something that is unauthorized or that is irregular, that to me should constitute a corrupt activity, because you can't be a CFO and engage in over expenditure of a 1 billion rand knowing that it is against the internal control systems and still go on to do it. That becomes corrupt. But it doesn't mean that services were not provided and that things were not delivered. It just means that at the point of payment, you did something that is inconsistent with your integrity as a financial officer. And I think what we'll do is we'll continuously have conversations with society. We'll be very honest as well,
Sure.
in terms of our approach in our shortcomings, in terms of our weaknesses, but also as well speak of the increases. Now, the best way to do it is to obviously have more stringent internal control systems.
Sure.
So the Auditor General every year, the take is that in every year the Auditor General does not even have to look at our books. Korotsweri template wherever she is.
Yeah.
Because that which she said 5 years ago remains relevant till today. It's a regurgitating of statements and recommendations
Changing
and
dates.
findings. It's just the changing of dates and changing of certain services providers. But ultimately, she can even anticipate what these audit findings are going to be on this year. And that must change.
Sure.
So we've got a resolution track of the Auditor General's findings that we're trying to close up and correct so that they don't become findings in the next financial year.
Agreed. But the question, the essence of it, apologies to interrupt, but the essence of the question is that whilst you would have fruitless and wasteful expenditure, which may not necessarily mean that there was corruption, it could mean that there was no benefit for the entity, the department, whatever, or for whatever exercise.
Overcapitalization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily corruption, as you've said.
Yeah.
But where there are instances of corruption, I think the question wants to know, are you able to put your neck on the line to legally pursue means where the individuals would be pursued and with the intention of deriving that which was lost?
Definitely. Without a shadow of a doubt, and you need to just reflect and go back to how we dealt with many of the matters when I was still the chair of MPAC in the city of Ekurhuleni, where not only would write off what we think would have been value for money, but would come for the companies, including their directors. So we're the only people who initiated the aspect of saying that people must be blacklisted, companies must be blacklisted, and over and above companies being blacklisted, is directors of those companies must be blacklisted, because they just come back with a different name and then still participate. We're the first people to introduce that directors must be blacklisted as well. And then we go for the money. And where we can recoup, we are going to recoup. So we hold the same, without a lack of better words, sentiment going towards the province. We've got no friends. We are hoping that we are not going to get enemies on the basis that we are out here looking for the state and looking for the monies of the state that were taken away from its coffers. And not only are we putting our neck, we are putting our head, our feet, and arms, everything
on
in
the
it
block.
to say that definitely something must give.
Yeah.
And to show you that something must give, we're the first people to identify, even before the Auditor General, by the way, that the Gautrain Management Agency had irregularly spent 958 million rand before the closing of the financial year. Monies that was not appropriated to them, which constitute that this money is irregular and heads must roll.
And are they rolling now? What is the action on that? How train management?
Look, we have given our response to the Department of Transport as well as the Premier in terms of what ought to be done, because at this point, the CEO and the CFO ought to have been dealt with. And we're hoping that outside of political discussions, that decision manifests itself. If we had the right to do it, we would have done it.
What is that
to
decision?
Identify.
What is that decision that you've given to the Premier on how train management after finding, I mean, that's a huge figure. Sounds like a billion rands.
People must be held to account. They must be held accountable. And there must be recourse outside of building internal control systems, because the building of our internal control systems was able for us to identify that there's something.
Yeah.
Now that we have identified, it's unfortunately outside of our scope to deal with the matters.
Sure.
Hence, we have brought it to the attention
Authorities.
of the departments and the relevant authorities.
I hear
who
that.
must
and
act.
I'm not being a sensationalist.
Yeah.
I truly am not. But one must, I think, also appreciate that the word accountability in the South African lexicon, especially in politics, has become loosely used as and when anyone wants to sound responsible. And we've had it a million times. And I'm really not being sensationalist when I say this, that what does that really mean in this particular example that you've given us about the Gautrain on the CEO and the CFO thereof? Your recommendations, we understand it's not up to you, but if it were up to you, were they going to face legal, criminal charges? What is it? And I'm saying that with a desirable appetite on behalf of those who are listening to know that something is taking place.
Yeah, look, I think that how we handle, and I agree with you to a certain extent, and how we view it becomes extremely subjective to how we respond to what accountability is.
Sure.
But if you were to give me the right to deal with them, they would be suspended immediately, without a shadow of a doubt.
Were they irresponsible?
No, they were extremely irresponsible. They ought to have known. They ought to have known that financial management, in this case, dictates that you cannot spend money that is not appropriated to you. More so when we have continuously informed them that you can't spend this money, it must come back to the Gauteng provincial fund, so that it can be attributed to other cornerstones of service delivery. You know, they just decided to take a decision between the two of them and spend it. Now we're sitting with eggs on our faces, because we need to declare that, by the way, to the Auditor General, and it's going to become a finding. And therefore, they will not be granted a clean audit, regardless of the explanation that they might have. And that has an impact, you know, on how society sees us, because instantly, once you say 959 irregular expenditure, you attribute it to corruption.
Yeah.
It's as clear as that. So by now they ought to have been suspended
and facing charges.
And facing charges of not only maladministration, but also defying that which is internal control systems that are put in place.
Yet they're still in office.
Yeah.
They wearing beautiful suits, smelling nice, occupying corner offices, going to work, and with all those privileges, medical aid, travel allowance, and all of that, after such huge amounts of money were spent not in a proper way.
Like many of other administrators, you know, who sit and linger in the corridors after having done so much damage to the state. You know, we're yet to get a report in terms of people who have been suspended as a result of financial mismanagement of some way or the other. You know, you have had the conversation at national level, where billions are spent on people who are suspended. But it also speaks to the labor relations, by the way,
Yeah.
which and unions and the voice of the unions, that they need to come to the party in terms of this particular understanding. And I, to a certain extent, some things are done maliciously by even political authorities wanting to deal with certain people because maybe they did not want to take certain mandates that are shadow and so forth. I get that, but there are also certain instances where there's a genuine discourse for holding people to account. And the legislation makes it at times extremely difficult because it prolongs the process. When someone does not come and attend a particular hearing, it can span out to a year or two and then come back to ask the legitimacy of this process on the basis that it does not conform to the time frames. So it's I think it's a conversation
Sure.
that must not only be held internally
Of
but
course.
also the external forces.
How
that
far do your powers
contribute
go
it.
in this situation? That's all that you can do. Recommend and leave it at that. And next year they're back again in the offices.
And also, document it, have society know, and continuously engage as well with the authorities that this is it, this must be dealt with,
Yeah.
and not keep quiet about it and hide it under a
Yeah.
table and desk. And given an opportunity to advance the discourse, will definitely do it, and it's based on principle and nothing more.
So I'm speaking to Nkululeko Dunga, who's Gauteng MEC for Finance. You're on 702, 11 minutes to 11 o'clock. Let's take some of your voice notes, but after the break. Stay tuned. I will take some of your calls on 011-883-0702.
Saddle up. Hollywood Bets invites you to join the race day festivities this champion season. The 2026 Grade 1 Hollywood Bets Gold Challenge kickstarts the action. Gallop towards your chance to win a share of 2.5 million rand in cash and prizes with the thrilling Season of Champions competition. Bet 50 rand or more on horse racing online or at your nearest branch and put yourself in the running for gold. Bet now. T's and C's apply. Hollywood Sportsbook is a licensed betting operator. No persons under the age of 18 years are permitted to gamble. Winners know when to stop. South African Responsible Gambling Foundation toll-free counseling line 0800 006 008 or WhatsApp help to 076 675 0710.
Still shopping around for a saving here and a deal there? Choose Checkers, SA's #1 in value supermarket, and save on deals like Kellogg's Cornflakes 1 kg for $76.99, Nescafe Cappuccino Sticks 10 per pack. Buy any two and get a third free. Save 80 rand. And Twin Saver 2-ply white toilet rolls 24 per pack for $159.99. Save 30 rand. Valid until 7 June. Only at Checkers.
What if the problem you faced became the business that changed everything? That's what Nedbank Business Ignite on 702 is all about, with this year's theme, My Pain, My Peppers, My Solution. We are calling on small businesses that turned real changes into powerful ideas. You could win 200,000 rands in cash, plus mentorship, business support, and tools to help you grow sustainably. Enter the Nedbank Business Ignite on 702 now at primemediaplus.com. Igniteyourbusiness.co.za. See money differently. Nedbank, an authorized FSP and registered credit provider. T's and C's apply.
702
Let's walk the talk on 92.7
and 106 FM.
8 to 11. The MEC of Finance in Gauteng, Nkululeko Dunga, is joining me. He's right in front of me in studio. We're speaking about the finances in the Gauteng province, which is truly the center of the economy, not just of our country, but generally of the continent. I'd love to hear from you on 072 702 1702.
Good morning, Thabo. It's Ndile in Kagiso. Please ask my commissar to answer this question for me, as he is in finance. If somebody doesn't spend the budget, why Treasury take that money back? Because to me, it feels like people are being punished twice. Somebody is not doing their job. You take the budget, you take it back to Treasury. Why don't you just deal with that person and the service delivery continues? Because that person has punished the citizens by not spending their money, and now Treasury takes it back to to Treasury is not helping at all. Why don't he change that? If you can answer that for me, please. Thank you, Sindile.
Tower and the MEC, I just want to know how are they going up to get the people to start paying for services? Because if you're not getting a cent from 1 million people, I mean, really, if they had to pay 100 rands each, it can help the municipality. They must get people to pay, because some of the people, you find them at the hair salons and all that, especially during SASA. They occupy all those hair salons, they do their nails. Some of us, we work, but we couldn't even afford to do our nails. But they don't want to pay for the services. How are they going to get the people to pay for the services? That little bit will help the municipality, because we can't have 2 million people paying for 10 million people. It's Veronica from Spraydview. Thank you.
Hi, Tabo. Please ask your guest, what does it take if people are suspended and they're still getting paid in full with all the benefits? People are still stealing money with their cronies or friends in higher places. It's all very well to say that they're going to prosecute them, they'll go after them, but what does it take to physically do that? Why are our courts not full of these looters yet? Why are our prisons not full of these looters yet? I'd like to hear the response to that. Thank you. This is Ursula.
Ursula, thanks very much. MEC, we don't have a lot of time. We have about 3 minutes, so I'm going to ask you to spend about 40 seconds on each question there because we're going to say goodbye shortly, starting with the first ones first, or whichever order that you prefer.
Yeah, to answer also the previous question, when you were saying that the funding model of municipalities is incorrect and must be changed, we agree with that. As hence, the only other option that you would have, instead of charging people rates and taxes, instead of charging people water and electricity extensively so, is that the municipalities must engage in business. And that's how you build state capacity. And once they are able to make revenue and profit outside of rates and electricity and water, then you get your buffer point there, where you will spend much more less in terms of the payment towards municipalities for those services. But going into under expenditure, the unfortunate part is that we run 180 billion rand budget, and only about 8 billion or so of it, it's our own revenue. So we can dictate what happens to that amount that we spend. But all the others, 140 billion, 30 billion, 140 billion is equitable share, which comes from national government. Yeah. And about 30 billion of it is then conditional grants that comes from national treasury. Sure. And that tells, it's very specific to the activities that you need to undertake. And when you have not undertaken those activities and infrastructure development, paid for certain services, that money must then be taken back to national treasury. Yeah. There is a process for a rollover that you can then ask for, but it's based on a business case study as to whether will you be able to spend that money in the next financial year, So national government cannot give you money for housing and then you spend that money for something else. You need to spend it for housing, and if you have not spent it for housing, you need to return it back and ask that money be rolled over for the next year so that you are able to spend it. We have also and I know we have had this debate in terms of holding people to account, we've also included part of performance to be attributed towards the expenditure aspect of it, because it's very important in terms of the money that we allocate to you, in terms of business case studies that you would have given us, and how much you spend, because that just relatively means that when you have underspent, you have underperformed on what is non-financial, and that is on your core duties as an administrator. And we have held people to account for that regard. In terms of holding people to account, and I know once again we've expressed that decision, we're still very clear that people must be held to account objectively so. Sure. And where there are financial ramifications for the longevity thereof, we must be able to reflect back on it and say, this has taken this much. In terms of the circulars of human resource, it says you must deal with these matters within a period of 3 months. There's really no need why or any explanation that we can give why some of these matters take up to a year. If the prescripts and the legal prescripts are there to deal with many of these matters within 3 months, it's a lack of political will to a certain extent.
And will you, as the MEC and also the member of the EFF, have courage, chutzpah enough to hold the ANC to account and even call for their heads, even though you serve in the executive?
Look, in anyone and everyone, and it's not just a limitation, by the way, towards a certain political party. That is inclusive of anyone that can be associated with the EFF, anyone's associated with any other political organization, and also even anyone associated with the NPOs and NGOs, because they've become extremely political now, and we need to have that discussion in terms of their monitoring. You'll find a lot of people of NPOs and NGOs who are administrators in government would not necessarily attach to any political office and still have the backing of what is political on the basis that they own and run NGOs and
I'll
NPOs.
have to say goodbye. I wanted to speak to you for 3 hours, so it's not allowed to do that. You'll have to come back at some other time. I really enjoyed speaking to you, Nkululeko Dunga, Gauteng MEC for Finance. Thanks for coming through.
Hanging out with Clement.
On 702.
Let's walk the talk.